I appreciate, and one of the joys of getting to chair is you get to put yourself at the end, and we have this term sort of, I don't get the clock, so our next meeting is a couple hours, so let's have at it. Okay. Like a couple of you, you've spoken about, it's sort of amusing being someone from the desert. I've had a fascination with visiting ports. This time last year, I was in the port of Singapore, visiting some of the new construction, watching the automation. I've been to a number of them. I've also visited the port of LA and Long Beach, and I saw the same thing. And so, look, the vision for this hearing was, what can we make the future look like? Politically, we always have the habit of, we got to get in our shots at each other, because that's what makes a good YouTube video for when we want to put up our 20 seconds. So let me do my 20 seconds. But we actually have occasions like this where in the Inflation Reduction Act and those, we have language functionally making automation illegal. Well, it turns out my own president actually put out a statement that he wasn't thrilled with the idea of automation of ports. I border on being a techno-utopian. So let's actually play a game here. You're all freaky smart. If I came to you today and said, whether it be from a regulation, from a technology, from even domestic repatriation of certain activities, to incentive models that you've written about, if we could start from, and accept this is not real, but if starting from clean slate, how efficient could I make our supply chain infrastructure? You know, so we'll deal with the products and the desire and style and those things. But Dr. McLaughlin, you already know of my fascination with the automated skids for rail. You know, they're electric, they're environmentally safer. You put, like in the Port of Long Beach, you immediately put it on the skid and it goes to the warehouse it's supposed to go, or the distribution center, to the things I've seen of, the laser measured automated lifts at the ports, to the ability, some of the technology where the container ship is able to moor within minutes compared to hours. Dr. McLaughlin, if I came to you right now and said, you get to be a techno-utopian and design a new port that everything from the rail to the rules to the regs to the automation, give me your vision.
I would try to remove myself as much as possible from picking the paths and let people innovate in ways that are maximally profitable to them.
What are you, a classic market
this is a punt,
economist?
but I mean, the point from my perspective is to set up the infrastructure, if you will, and by that I mean the regulatory infrastructure, the legal infrastructure that permits innovation. And so by that, we need things that are streamlined, need things that are flexible, things that accommodate new technologies when they do come about, because we can't predict all the ones that would come about.
Okay, Doctor.
There are some examples. If we want to go and look at Dubai, that started basically from nothing and became a leading logistics hub of, they have one of the best airlines, they have one of the best ports, they have lots of infrastructure that started from nothing. Now, the truth is that autocracy is benevolent autocracy is the best form of government. They don't stay benevolent for long. That's the problem. So you have, Dubai with money and total control. Yeah, they do good things like China. President Trump was there singing their praises of building everything. But if we look at, there are examples of, if we look at the Dutch port of Rotterdam, Chinese highways. I mean, they're amazing, actually. I go to China quite a bit. There are European trains. You know what kills me when I go to Spain? I can deal with German high-speed train, with French high-speed train. But you go to Spain and they have high-speed train? That's ridiculous. And we still don't have it. To build a train from, what is it, in California, the New York Times reported that it takes 9 times per mile the cost of building in California.
It may be even worse than that if you actually.
As compared to France. Not as compared to, it's compared to France. So talk about regulation but it's not only regulation, it's corruption, to be fair. There's a lot of things that are into it that we must clean out in order to get European level port, European level trains, Chinese level highways, Dutch level ports. All of these things should be cleaned.
Okay, thank you. My utopia is most of the container terminals in the world are operated, somewhat controlled, leased by terminal operators. They are very large conglomerates, the HBH, Port of Singapore Authority. Mm-hmm. And they know their business. They know how to make things very, very efficient. And the problem is, like anybody else, they don't like uncertainty. And right now we are in a phase of readjustment of the trade regime, which creates uncertainty. We are in a disruption phase of the resilience curve, you could say. And it's going to reach a new equilibrium. But my point is, there are already corporations, which are many of them are branches of shipping lines, that are experts at making supply chain efficient. But when their strategy or their investment hit the road and they encountered the regulatory system, the delay in investment, I saw quite a few port projects in North America being canceled because of regulation. And I say, here goes 1 million TEU, here goes 2 million TEU, because we cannot build infrastructure. It's when we don't have the capability to operate it, but we don't have the capability and create an investment framework which is stable enough for that capital which is already there, that expertise, that technology which is already there. There are companies, that are now having drone-making companies that are part of a port terminal operator. They're implementing this technology. They all have these strategies. But it's very difficult to implement them in the United States, as you mentioned before, because automation is becoming illegal in some ways. We are becoming the Luddites of this world in some ways. Again, it's an overstatement, of course, but there's a little bit of truth.
You may have just won an award. I think you're the first one this year in the congressional record to say Luddite. Okay. Doctor.
Thank you. Since my colleagues have been talking about physical supply chain infrastructure, let me talk maybe just also a little bit about the workforce supply infrastructure. So this has traditionally been a local and state responsibility, but we have basically broken chains between students and workers and their abilities to find the jobs that firms and industries are supplying. So, but there is and firms similarly are having difficulty finding the characteristics and the talents and the skills that they need for their operations. What we have the technology available to actually circle this square. So we have, for example, we all use Google Maps or Waze to find our way to a destination that we don't know. It tells you to turn right, avoid a traffic jam here, turn left here, take that bridge, and so forth, turn-by-turn directions. There is similarly a possibility to use software to tell workers to take this course in the community college, top it up with this credential, take this university credit, and work your way to what the industry is asking for. That is something that is missing, and that is actually the technology to do that is off the shelf. On the other side, industry is looking for workers with specific types of skills. So let me give you a quick anecdote. There was this lady who was working at a Dunkin' Donut shop. She had the skills to manage her shop, manage the inventory, which was perishable, manage customers, manage the payroll, manage. Those skills were what the semiconductor company that was setting up a fab was looking for. And by looking at it from a perspective of a dating app, which we're all familiar with perhaps to some degree or the other, they were able to look at the characteristics, and then they found this lady, and they were able to train her, and to the final stretch. And she's now working in a semiconductor fabrication plant.
Doctor, in some ways you're making the argument for time for a revolution in accreditation.
That's also a part of that.
And the
Yeah,
barriers
but
that creates.
there are existing solutions. There is a nonprofit called NIICA, which actually has the software to do this, and it's just a matter of and they are looking at this kind of combines like in a turn by turn, aggregate data, user data to put these to help solve the workforce problem and to get our workforce fixed. So that's a
So you have human input, you have regulation, you have technology adoption, you have, what is world trade. So if I came to you, let's first do a reference. And it's probably 3 years ago in one of my binders, I actually have it's actually someone's doctoral thesis. But the premise in there is, what would happen if tomorrow you threw a switch and every vehicle on American highways was automated? So Waymo of the truck, Waymo this, and they were trying to calculate its additive effect to GDP, and it was remarkable. The value of time, the value of the fact I can sit in the back seat and do my work, I can do this. And for the last couple of years, I've been thinking over and over and over, one of the things that rarely comes up when we talk about labor force is the fact that the number of 18-year-olds that will turn 18 this year as a percentage of population, I think, is the smallest in U.S. history. Mm-hmm. Yet our number of those 65 and up in the last 20 years has doubled. We have a demographic issue. And it's all over the industrialized world, we have a shortage of young people. And if we want to deal with the reality of how do you have productivity, how do you move goods and services in a way where you could have that productivity so we can maintain societal growth, lifestyle, those things in a functioning a flat or shrinking population with its ratios upside down, we're going to need a revolution in what is regulation. And look, 7 years ago, I did a silly little YouTube video. Actually had an artist draw a cartoon, and it was the concept of crowdsourcing air quality. You attach a $99 thing to this, put a couple thousand in your community, and do you need someone to get an air quality permit to do the motorcycle paint shop? Because we all know putting paperwork in file cabinets makes the air quality cleaner. It's documentation for the next lawsuit. But the fact of the matter is, if I had crowdsource, the moment that person's filters aren't working in the paint booths, you catch them immediately. And you also catch the clowns that are painting cars in their backyard that were never going to be part of the air quality regulatory regime. Crowdsource the environmental data. Well, it turns out you can do that in water and markets and all sorts of things. And in this brilliant place, I've proposed that bill now, 7+ years, and it will never get a hearing because it turns out the current regulatory regime actually has the incumbency effect. The folks that make their money off of being the one that shows up to be your engineer who signs off on your filters, to the bureaucracy that sticks the paper in the file cabinet. And that was one of the reasons for doing this hearing, is there's a way to do, from the port automation to my fascination of the automated skids to data that you and I, and methods we actually don't know, to actually having an education system that values your skill set and your talents, not where you fit into a regulatory education regime, which all these are, we just, by those last couple of sentences, just enraged all our constituencies, because those barriers to entry, those regulations, those business models are how they make a living. And so what I'm begging from all of you is give us an idea. It's, okay, so regulation's a huge barrier. Is there a way where my vision of using AI, using crowdsourcing, revolutionizes it? The value of push adopt the next generation of technology. Those of us that have a fascination in generative AI, but I don't know what it's actually going to do. I'm not as bright as I think I am. I couldn't get into your university. But they sent a lovely rejection letter. So, I mean, am I just rambling? Because I've had stunning amounts of coffee already. I mean, is there a vision here we can sell? Let's go, Dr. McLaughlin.
Yeah, I think one of the problems you touched on is the existing regulatory system and how slow it can be. Right? I'm sure that many regulators inside the EPA, for example, would love to crowdsource some monitoring of air quality. But the path going from here to there, where a regulation allows that, is too fraught with obstacles and takes too long. So your vision of using, say, AI and crowdsourcing, those would be tremendous upgrades to accommodate new technology. Right now, what we have to do to accommodate new technology is often use soft law, have agencies issue guidance on how regulations might look if you were to invent an autonomous car, for example. But if instead we're able to update regulations more quickly using AI, for example, or crowdsourcing, we wouldn't run into this problem nearly as often, this problem being called the pacing problem. Technology outpaces regulations. So I think we can upgrade the pace, but it does require Congress to do this. The procedure is defined by Congress, the Administrative Procedure Act.
Okay. And doctor, remember, our word of the day is Luddite. And is your mic on?
I'm on? Okay, sorry. We have to find a way to overcome the short-term resistance in order to get long-term benefits. You mentioned autonomous vehicles. I deal with autonomous trucks. The amazing productivity. But the top job in 23 states in the United States is truck driver. So there will be people sitting on both sides who will fight tooth and nails against it.
But yet you and I see the demographics of
I
the age
couldn't
of
agree
my
with you
average
more.
truck driver.
I live in a university.
In a decade, we have massive shortages.
Well, it's not quite that simple because it's tied to an immigration policy.
Yes.
So it's, Angela Merkel didn't allow 1 million Syrians to come in because of her good heart. She allowed because the Germany were losing workers in factories. So, and she understood it early. So we need, I mentioned before, we need to create some kind of point system like advanced state.
Take a look at my talent-based immigration bill I introduced a couple of weeks ago, and I thought I'd get my head kicked in. Shockingly, I had both folks from the left and the right go, yeah, it makes sense.
Jesus. Okay. One last point. You mentioned the stickiness of regulation. I actually wrote a few papers on the stickiness of tariffs. If the tariffs are going to stay, there will be constituents developed to keep them forever, because there are companies and people that benefit from this. Not only the people who manage this, but companies who can raise their price because the competitor now has high prices. So
your colleague to your left actually mentioned rent seeking in that environment.
absolutely. And let it not say that I belong to left or right. I'm just trying to state the fact.
But that is the nature of, remember, and you and I have had this conversation dozens of times. Washington, D.C. is mostly about one thing, money. Usually, whether it be barriers to entry, whether it be direct subsidies, whether it be, and it breaks my heart because, believing markets actually are innovation. And in many ways, we've abandoned that concept. So, tell me, is my utopian vision of, okay, we have a demographic issue that's going to continue to, it hits us very hard, shockingly soon. Is it, okay, open up the border? Is it the adoption of technology? If I'm going to maintain a productivity and therefore GDP, therefore, lifestyle, innovation, growth, and and how American people live.
It's quite a,
It's a universal theory.
it's quite a tall order. In some ways, all roads lead to automation down the road. The problem will be, or the issue will be how this is going to be deployed. And is it going to be a synchronous deployment, or is it going to be an asynchronous deployment? If it's synchronous, you can manage things. But if it's by industrial sector, it's going to create disruptions and lack of synchronization between things. So that's a very, very difficult question to answer. But on the other hand, I've looked at international trade for quite a long time, and it is imbalanced. In my opinion, it is unsustainable. It has created, I would say, commercial structures which, from a distance and transportation perspective, do not make sense that much. They exist because the transportation cost is very low, very cheap, and it has created these global supply chains, many of which should be more regional focus. And I suspect automation is going to incite us to look at regionalization of things, the regionalization of our manufacturing. The
So is this
regionalization-
back to the sort of the hub, especially hub concepts?
concept. Of course, we're going to still trade long distance. Going to be a lot of it, but it will make a little bit more sense, because I don't think it makes sense to make a toy at the other side of the world to move it here. We do that because it's convenient, because there's a cost structure behind it. But on the long term, I'm skeptical, I would say. Although I'm a very big proponent of free trade and things like that, but it went in very strange ways over the last 30 or 40 years. So we've seen supply chains have emerged that are bizarre. But when you look at them, they make sense from a low-cost perspective.
Doctor, can you give me a vision that is not as, let's say you and I actually synchronize on labor inputs. What is acceptable in automation, in the use of 3D, the printing, all the other types of technology? Does that stabilize wages or help us produce wage growth and other things? What, if I'm trying to deal with a supply chain that it's very fragile, we've already seen certain inputs and I get a cascade effect. What would you do technology-wise?
Well, just to put this in a little perspective, the strategic environment in which we operate in the world is radically different. And I think in many ways, the election of President Trump, the electorate has sent a message that the way in which we do things has to be disrupted. And I think that's an important message that all of you in Congress also are very attuned to. We need to be thinking in terms of how do we leapfrog China in technologies, because that's the only way we're going to be a leader. But in terms of whether it's workforce or whether it's modernizing our supply chains, these are investments that have to be rethought, given the fact that we have new technologies, artificial intelligence, robotics. All of this has the existing models, as you say, have been gamed and to the point that they are immobile almost. We cannot compete globally with the existing structures that we have, whether it's physical infrastructure or the regulatory infrastructure.
Okay.
So this is actually something that is across the board. It's not one party or an individual who is.
And maybe that's my vanity of trying to believe, could we ever sell the concept of a much more unified theory? And look, and I just need to throw this out because one of those I'm constantly worried about parts of the CHIPS Act. Love the investment in research and development, but there's a couple great academic papers, and now you see actually doing a much broader error correction on a quantum chip. But as soon as that error correction, even if I have to slow it down, do a server farm that takes care of my errors on a quantum, I have hundreds of billions of dollars in fabs that almost become stranded assets the next day. And there's sometimes the arrogance of what we do in Congress, saying we're going to invest in an industry we like, instead of allowing the technology and the disruption to drive it. You know, for the young people in here, you have no idea what I'm about to say, but there used to be this thing called Blockbuster Video. And if they had hired enough lobbyists, we would have slowed down the internet for them. And I'd like to give you an example. But maybe as much as 2 years ago, we did a hearing here, and one of the discussions was pharmaceutical manufacturing. And I think we may have done it in the Ways and Means Committee. And we had one witness sort of make a point saying, okay, United States, why do we import so many of these generic drugs? And it turns out he had a couple charts that showed some of the precursors that go into like this generic small molecule drug, or create, for every pound I got of the precursor that goes into the pharmaceutical, it created hundreds of pounds of really nasty, fairly highly toxic byproducts. And his point was, tell me how I get that permitted to make that input in the United States. Do you have high temperature incineration? And there was a reason it was being made in India and China, those inputs. So we will have the brain trust, you know, these types, these electeds will say, we want to repatriate pharmaceutical manufacturing. Okay. But the regulatory and also infrastructure of, okay, what's my mitigation of toxic waste products? And those sorts of things. And everyone wanted to talk about the repatriation of pharmaceuticals, but no one wanted to have the conversation of the infrastructure of how do you actually deal with these inputs, and they're sometimes nasty byproducts. And that is actually part of my fixation of, we talk supply chain and how we modernize it. And yes, okay, fascination with port infrastructure, electric skids, and the next generation of AI training and those things, and automation that you and I may have no idea. What does a future world trade regime look like? USMCA, do we actually truly build a North American supply chain that actually is much more efficient? And our barriers are, we have, the Joint Economics staff was kind enough to build this, provide me sheet after sheet of regulatory barriers. So we do Inflation Reduction Act, and then we add dozens of rules that make it so, okay, we have businesses willing to take the checks, but the innovation we just crushed by our own reg sets. Please help us. Help us come up with ideas where our arrogance of thinking we can design what the future economy looks like. I worry that the populism needs planned economy, industrial policy, and over we can show you what we move resources to within a decade, it's a stranded investment. Help us plan for the future in the reality of what our demographics are. And it's a very different vision, but I see supply chain making it much less fragile, much more robust, and much more innovative is an absolute necessity if we're going to actually start to maintain any type of reasonable type of GDP growth. Any last comments as before I throw the gavel and go heat up my coffee? Thank you. This was one of the most interesting and actually learned panels I've ever had in my time in the Joint Economic Committee. I appreciate all of you. Thank you all. And with that, we're done.